recognition that is of the most egregious incidents, there lies an untold story of many other similar mass shootings that have been going on without being reported in the news. There have been, on average, 2 mass shootings a day, over 200 this year already. They're simply just so commonplace that they're not newsworthy anymore. Well, our hearts go out to the victims' families and the other victims, the wounded and the witnesses, people who will be scarred by this violence throughout their lives. And what does it do to the rest of us who are not even there? It undermines our sense of safety. Evidently, there is something going on in America today that is different. There's a kind of malaise that's gripping the country. It has been expressed in these violent outbursts that originate in personal grievance, in frustration, through bizarre political theories, old-fashioned racism and xenophobia. And now it's infecting all of us with this sense of doom and an emerging sense that there's a trend among segments of society that is spiraling out of control. It's right to be energized, to insist even more forcefully than before on some kind of gun safety issues. The easy availability of guns, especially those with outrageous lethality, I can't see how anyone can justify the existence of these AR-15 military-style rockets. Rifles, just stupefying. But clearly there is an underlying malaise that's motivating people to buy them, as they explain, for protection, and for a small percentage, though a standout percentage of them, who actually turn these weapons upon other people. What makes the outrage even more sharp is that the Buffalo shooter, for example, was apparently not mentally disabled in a clinical sense, nor was he aiming to settle scores like your typical gangster. He was a young man who was carried away by the rhetoric broadcast by politicians and popular pundits and right-wing media that have been fomenting and encouraging racist attitudes and beliefs. That shooter took their message literally and personally, and he sought to follow their advice. These broadcasters overtly foment hatred and division in our society. Someone among their listeners will inevitably take their words literally and do the kind of harm that happened in Buffalo. An abiding mystery is how people who look sane and who effectively express themselves in coherent English can wallow in such hatred. But just as important, how can there be fertile ground for these ideas to take root? It's our job to try to understand how these ideas can take root and how to combat racism, xenophobia, and ethnic hatred. Our country depends on it. And as people who view ethics as the key to building a better society, one that is humane, equitable, and just, and survivable, we have to apply our skills to understand where we are in history right now and where we're going. So the topic today was supposed to be, and still is, economic inequality. Inequality in wealth and in income. I'm going to suggest that there's a clue to what this malaise is about by looking at our society from a perspective of economics. There's been a growing recognition that in America today, there's a degree of economic inequality that is way beyond historic norms, and that it creates its own deleterious effect upon our society. So will this tell us something about the division, the fear, and the random violence in America today? Well, why is inequality bad? It seems unjust. But for one thing, what's relevant to our question today is that recent research has uncovered a strong correlation, a remarkable correlation, between the level of inequality in a society and the lack of trust between people in that society. Trust is the glue that holds a community together. Trust creates community by building on a sense of mutuality, mutual acceptance, mutual concern, mutual reliance, and the expectation of basic honesty and goodwill. You couldn't really cross town without a fundamental trust in all the strangers that you pass, that they'll stop at red lights, that they'll not rob you, that people will help you if you're really in need. Remember Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in Verona. They couldn't cross town unless they took the whole gang with them. And even so, Mercurio was stabbed, right? Surveys measure the degree to which people have faith in institutions like government, banks, consumer products, corporations, as well as each other. It's been shown that where there's been a great disparity in wealth and income, it corresponds with a level of distrust in that society. So how do we assess fairness in wealth distribution? So I'm going to call on chart 1. I'm going to do a couple of charts, so don't get scared. It's not going to be on the test. So in chart 1, it's going to show 2 models of wealth distribution. Now, this is used by Robert Reich in a lecture he did earlier this year. In surveys, people are asked which kind of distribution they thought was ideal, A or B. So let me just say, look, you have it.
I'm off to share the screen. People on Zoom.
There you go. So these are wealth distributions by by 20% quintile. So the top 20% is in blue, then the second highest is in red, the third highest, fourth highest, and fifth highest, 20% of income. And in B, you see that the top 20% has 32% of the income. In model A, the top 20% has a lot more, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 58% or so of the income. So which do you think is more just? A, B, B? And which do you think more accurately depicts what the reality is? A. Okay, so I'm going to show you another chart now because Robert Reich tricks you. That's not really what the actual distribution is. The actual distribution is in chart 2. There you go. The actual chart shows that the top 20% owns 84% of the wealth in America. The bottom 40% are not even on the chart because they really own nothing. Actually, it's the bottom 50% that owns nothing. So the difference is really extreme. But as extreme as this is, the trend is accelerating. Now, I refer to this as raging inequality because it's more than a condition, it's a process, and it's continuing to accelerate. Inequality can be measured, and national economies can be compared. An Italian statistician and a sociologist, Corrado Gini, devised what's called, after himself, the Gini coefficient. It measures inequality by showing how skewed the wealth distribution is from an even distribution. By comparing these percentages, the first fifth, the second fifth, and also it factors in the effect of government interventions and levelers that try to even things out, such as public assistance and progressive tax that moderate wealth disparities. It can be a rough measure, but it works pretty well for making comparisons between economies. And if you look up a country in Wikipedia, you know, on the right side, they have a column of stats, and the Gini coefficient is one of them that regularly appears. So you can look up the Gini coefficient for any country. Well, based on this calculation, the US is one of the most unequal economies in the world. Now, we like to think of our country as largely middle class, but we've become, primarily in the last 40 years, vastly unequal as a society. America's Gini number is up there with Paraguay and Brazil. We used to make fun of the South American countries as banana republics, but we've become one of them, at least by this measure. So it goes from 0 to 100. 0 is perfect equality where everyone has the exact same thing. And 100 is the other extreme where one person has everything and nobody else has anything. So 0 to 100. And obviously, everybody's in the middle somewhere, and the middle is somewhere in the 30s. Canada is in the mid-30s. Sweden's number, for example, is 26. That's pretty low. But of course, Scandinavian countries are famous for their policies of egalitarianism. In contrast, Paraguay is high with 46. Honduras is even higher with 52, and those countries have had entrenched oligarchs. The US, it's really high, 48, higher than Paraguay. It's the highest among the G7, the highest among the OECD countries. Now, whether the person on the street knows these statistics or not, the impact on society of these disparities is felt. It's felt in the crumbling infrastructure. It's felt in the closing of rural hospitals, the consolidation of industries into monopolies with market domination. It's the pooling of power and fewer hands that impacts our lives. Now, it wasn't always this way. After World War II, there was much greater equality in the economy. Wages were relatively high on average. CEOs had higher salaries, of course, having a multiple of some 40 times the average worker's salary. But there was faith in the future. When we went to the moon, we kind of all went there together. Now, I don't want to get too carried away about this past halcyon time. There was crime and racism then too. But there was rather a broad sense of belonging and a participation that kind of has unraveled because of these conditions. There was a time, say, when Republicans and Democratic Congresspeople could argue all day, and then in the evening they'd play poker together and they'd drink together. They'd hammer out deals and they'd get things done. No more. This attitude of deadlock has filtered down to permeate really all our discourse. So what happened in the last 40 years to overturn this Camelot? There are several explanations for the separation of America into distant strata. For one, unions were frustrated. They were constrained by changes in the law, taking away a powerful force of worker protections. Even for those establishments that were not unionized, the mere activity of union pressure in the market elevated non-union wages too. Removed the union and everyone lost. Then taxes became much less progressive, as the highest incomes were taxed at lower and lower rates. So the wealthy were expected to participate less and less in underwriting America. Even their stake in the country attenuated along with that. Today, there's an international class of wealthy individuals and families whose capital flows from one side of the world to the other, from the Cook Islands to the Jersey Islands to the Bahamas, without committing to a home base. Last year, I did some document work with some wealthy lady, widow. She didn't tell me about all her stuff, but she said her money was in the BVI. BVI. I said, what the heck's the BVI? Dawned on me, the Bridget Virgin Islands. Yeah, she parked everything over in the Caribbean. The very idea of a corporation's role in society changed. Once the idea was that a corporation owed a duty to all the stakeholders in its circle. That includes its owners, its employees, its customers, its vendors, and the entire community in which it operated. There was a time, for example, that Rochester, New York was built by its corporate citizens. That's just an example. Kodak and Xerox supported the arts, a university specializing in engineering, and generally supporting the quality of life in the city. But starting in the 1970s, business schools began to teach that a corporation owed a duty only to its shareholders and no one else. In the 1980s came the corporate takeovers and the leveraged buyouts that saddled companies with debt to wring all the cash out of them. And in the 90s and 2000s, capital just left America to build a separate manufacturing base in China. With a lessening stake in America, the rich may have a diminishing concern, and that plays out in an ethic of disengagement. So just how concentrated is America's wealth? 1990, there were 66 billionaires. 2020, there were 614 billionaires. And now these billionaires had a total of this much money. In 1990, they had a total of $240 billion. In constant dollars, I'm going to make a comparison. In 2020, the billionaires, several hundred of them, had a total aggregate wealth of $4.2 trillion. So how much is a trillion? It's hard to really conceive, those kinds of numbers. So I'm going to try to make a comparison. If you stack up $100 bills, 3 1/3 feet, 3 feet 4 inches high, that's $1 million. So you have a stack of hundreds this high, you're a millionaire. So what's a billion? Well, they would have to stack up almost 2/3 of a mile high will be a billion. That's 2.5 Empire State Buildings, like foundation to tip, right? So what's a trillion? It's an exponentially higher number. It would be that stack of Benjamins 631 miles high. So the International Space Station would crash into the bottom of it. The station is 200 miles up. And this is 630 miles high would be. So think of 4 of those, and that's how much has been accumulated by the billionaire class. Another way to look at it is that's basically 1/5 of the entire economic output of the United States in a year. The United States gross national income is about $20 trillion. So 1/5 of that is all clustered into these relatively few hands. Now I'm going to go chart 3. For income, the largest rate of income growth is at the highest levels. This is the last chart. Okay, so I'll have to explain it, but it's worth it taking a minute to see this. So there are 2 lines on here. There's the line that starts on the upper left and goes down, and one that starts on the bottom left and goes up. So looking at just keep me one. Okay. So this one is the condition in 1980. That's 40 years ago. And income goes from the lowest income to the highest income. And this measures wage growth. So, every year there's more income that the United States in aggregate earns. And so who's getting that income growth? And in 1980, the poorest people got the largest percentage of income growth year to year. This tries to take away inflation. It's supposed to be real value. So as the income goes up, their relative growth in income goes somewhat down, but it's actually fairly even. The bottom line is the condition in the mid-2010s, the 2014. You'll see the lowest earning people at the bottom, the 5th percentile, are below 0. And there's a less and less share of the growth of income until you get to the 99th percentile, and then it goes up to the sky. It shows that the income growth in the United States has been garnered by only those in the higher income levels. So this is obviously expanding the distance between those who are the tippy top earners and those and everybody else. So today, a typical CEO is paid not 40 times as much as a regular worker, but 450 times what an average worker in the company he or she leads. If the degree, and here's the craziest one of all, if the degree of inequality remained the same as it was in 1980, and the degree of inequality didn't get more extreme, the median household income would be $30,000 more per year than it is today. In other words, the median income would be about 50% higher than it is now. Think of what that might mean for frustration in making ends meet. Well, let's stop for a minute and say, what's good about the concentration of wealth? Is there something good about it? Well, in 1889, Andrew Carnegie wrote an article in a magazine explaining just how important wealth was, like his own. You know, he was a very, very, very wealthy man. And he wrote in his article, the problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, so that the ties of brotherhood may still bind together the rich and poor in harmonious relationships. In other words, he doesn't talk about curing poverty or by raising the wages of the men in his steel plant. They're just to get along better. He thinks that wealthy people should be understood more. This disparity, he wrote, is beyond our power to alter and therefore to be accepted and made the best of. It is a waste of time to criticize what's inevitable. Men possessed of a peculiar nature for business affairs under the free play of economic forces must of necessity soon be in receipt of more revenue than can be judiciously expended upon themselves, and thus it will accumulate. Like he can't help it. He gets rich. He just can't help it. It's like iron filings just, come to him. But more than that, Carnegie wrote about the importance of wealth. With great concentrations of wealth, the rich can do great things. In contrast, if the money were spread around in the form of higher wages, the people would simply fritter it away on food and rent. Then, where would we get our universities and great libraries? Only through the creation of great fortunes can big projects in the public interest be built. And he goes on to describe the duty of the holders of great wealth to use it for public purposes. So it's a paternalistic view, noblesse oblige. Indeed, many of the universities bear the name of the industrialists, businessmen, and slave traders who founded them with their bequests. Dartmouth, Cornell, Brown, Fairleigh Dickinson, Rice, Rockefeller, not to mention the hundreds of buildings and universities and hospitals named in their honor. Bill Gates began a movement among billionaires to leave most of the money to charitable purposes instead of to their children, the so-called giving pledge. And numerous billionaires have kind of signed the pledge to do that. I saw a reference to about 154 billionaires who agreed to do that. All right, so what's bad about it, aside from not having it? Having the wealthy class make decisions about what's an important use of money and what is frivolous is not democracy. But we do get to see Jeff Bezos rocket up 60 miles in his own rocket ship. All right. With money pooling so dramatically in fewer hands and taxation reduced on those with the money, there are less resources for public purposes. Infrastructure is not built. It's said that the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that passed last year will only begin to help us catch up to other countries. With resistance from the richest people to invest in public schools, public health, infrastructure, mental health, climate crisis readiness, there'll be a continued and worsening crisis of confidence in the future. While rich people may donate to good causes, decisions about where public investment should be made is taken out of the democratic process and concentrated on vanity projects. Social Security and Medicare get less support as a smaller proportion of national income is within those brackets of the Social Security tax base. Child tax credit expansion reduced child poverty by 50%, well, for 1 year. It was not renewed, while New York City, nearly 1 in 3 children are in poverty. Beyond that, the new Economic Policy Institute report that's coming out now explains how unequal bargaining power in the workplace undermines civic engagement and democracy itself. From all this, people feel that they are not served, that there are fewer avenues of advancement, that the risks of life are more acute, and institutions like government, school, industry do nothing to help them, that life is not fair, that they're deprived of their due, their rights, that they're society's victims. So what do some people do? They look for scapegoats. Scapegoat is a traditional way to find the demons to hold you back and sabotage your efforts to build a life. Then you attack the demon that's in reach, the immigrant, the racial other, the unfair competitor, not the one beyond reach in the boardroom. So there is fertile ground for conspiracy theories, like theories about being replaced by foreign workers, by those on the other side of the tracks, about being displaced. Economic inequalities promote disparities in all aspects of life, in opportunity, in education, in health, in a future to which one can aspire. This nourishes the resentments that cause people to hate and to harm. So what would be some remedies? So I'll do this a little quickly, but there's an economist who's like the darling of the age, Thomas Piketty, a Frenchman who wrote this magisterial book, Capital in the 21st Century. And he explained, really better than anyone else, how inequality is a natural result of the open market system. And he did that by showing that there is a higher percentage return on capital than there is on labor. And if things are left to their own devices, it will just naturally cause a great disparity. Like Andrew Carnegie was right. So to ensure a system of greater equality, there has to be a constant intervention to ensure a recycling of money back into the system so it doesn't accumulate in these stagnant pools, but instead it re-enters the stream. So his ideal of a system, he calls it democratic socialism, and it does sound a lot like Bernie Sanders, is a society which is more participatory, more democratic, and federalist. It's ecological and multicultural. It engages everyone, but it strives for social justice. Now, he is actually a lot less pessimistic than I'm sounding, because in his latest book called A Brief History of Equality, he takes a much broader historical perspective and explains that since the late 18th century, the period of the Enlightenment, the West has been on this long upward slope of increasing equality. Before that, the strata of society were fixed and they were cruelly rigid, and there was no social mobility. But what will keep us going in that direction, and what will counter this sliding back that we're doing today? So his diagnosis is that the West is not just capitalistic, it's hyper-capitalistic. There's no social capital. There's nothing that's owned by society except the debt. We've got prairie lands in the West, we've got highways, and we've got public debt. So in order to recycle the money, he has 5 proposals. And you'll find four of them very familiar. And the first is a strong progressive income tax. And he harks back to the Eisenhower age when the highest bracket was 90%. And that was a Republican era, you know. It was John Kennedy who introduced lowering those rates. But obviously raising the taxes, so at the higher rates, it comes back. He also argues for a wealth tax. The wealth tax is really opposed by most people in the country, but we already do have one, as Elizabeth Warren kept on saying on her when she was running for president. Our real estate taxes are a wealth tax, you know, so it's not unheard of. And some states have wealth tax. Also, a social safety, second would be a social safety net to protect against the risks of life. And if there isn't this risk of failure, perhaps there would be less frustration and less fear. Part of that, I guess, is number three, a basic minimum income, which Yang was proposing in his presidential candidacy. A basic minimum income, there's enough money for that, for people to have something. He also suggests for number four, guaranteed employment. And he says there are plenty of green public works jobs that are going to be opening up that can be like a New Deal kind of a project. The fifth one is the one that you haven't heard of, and it's to make up for the lack of assets among the bottom 50%, there should be an inheritance redistribution given to each citizen. Like you should get a wealth package. And he figures it should be 60% of the national average wealth per adult. So the national average, this would come to about $150,000. So at age 25, everyone gets a gift of $150,000. So to get them started, it's like your stake, your starting stake. Now I could have used that. I know I could have used that. So, but the idea, I mean, it sort of makes up for the fact that the idea is that 50% start off behind the eight ball. And because there is no wealth there, but there is wealth in the system. So, and that would answer many questions about reparations, for example. Well, Thomas Piketty predicts that the failure to own up to some of these things will really lead to disastrous consequences where things will just reach an impossible breaking point. Maybe the ecological catastrophes that are really coming down the pike will create that. Well, after all this, here is my question for today. Is America a rich country? Is a country rich because it has a rich output when the income is channeled to a small elite with vast accumulated wealth? Or is the country rich for its investment in people and the opportunity it provides? If concierge healthcare is available, but healthcare is rationed for the middle class, is it a rich country? If it has world-class universities, but a crushing student debt, is it a rich country? If 1 in 3 of its children lives in poverty, is it a rich country? We've come to a time when we need to reappraise our vision for our country. If we have the will to reimagine it, we can preserve the rewards of success together and alongside a fair distribution that cushions the risks of life and fosters the potential of all its youth. There is enough wealth that we do create together, but only in a shared economy can there be a shared prosperity. Of course, this is only one of the many pieces of one piece of the many forces that make up our national experience, but this is fundamental. If economic justice were a reality in our country, a world of hurt could be avoided, and a big part of the resentment and this reactive lashing out by people out of their impotence could be resolved. What we need is the will to go there and the recognition that it's the right thing to do.